What I want to do is keep you on a little longer and create something for the patrons, because I have people who pay a little bit more to get a second half. There's still so much more to cover, actually. There's so many more questions I have for you. Do you have another 45 minutes, 30 to 45
Absolutely.
minutes? What do you think?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Adrian Johnston is chair of and distinguished professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque, and a faculty member at the Emory Psychoanalytic Institute in Atlanta. Is this still all correct? Am I on the right track here?
Save for I'm finished being chair of my department. I stepped down at the end of last academic year to my great relief. So now I'm just distinguished professor, but no longer department chair. But for me, that's a plus. Having served my 4-year sentence as an administrator, I am glad to be done with it.
Yeah, you and I are both getting more and more distinguished all the time. When I last talked to you 12 years ago, you were perhaps less distinguished. But you're the author of many books, including A New German Idealism, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2018. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Okay.
Perhaps we'll have a more general conversation about Hegelian thought today. Really, but you remember, I guess we talked about it before I started recording, but I just want to let everyone know that back in 2010 you were a guest on this podcast when it was only available in audio, and we talked about Zizek's ontology. Your book, The New German Idealism, is a follow-up to that book, and I guess I want to start by asking you what's changed in Zizek's theory that required you to adjust your critique of Zizek? Perhaps that's a very big question, but...
Well, what has emerged over the course of the past, I'd say in roughly the past decade, is that it has become increasingly clear to not only me, but to Zizek too, that for both of us, we've realized that there are some significant philosophical differences between us, despite there being also quite a bit of solidarity, agreement, shared, substantial shared interests and background and approaches to matters at the philosophical level. But nonetheless, in terms of this project that we both are pursuing in our own ways of developing a materialist ontology that also includes within itself a non-reductive account of human subjectivity. Mm-hmm. That for him, there are already inklings of this in his earlier work, most notably in his 1996 book, The Indivisible Remainder, with its lengthy chapter on quantum physics and Lacan. But this Lacanian appropriation of quantum physics has become much more central, I think, to Zizek's vision of a materialist ontology of a non-reductive sort that would also count as a kind of contemporary reinvention of dialectical materialism, and its roots in both German idealism and classical Marxism. And for Zizek, quantum physics has become even more important as the primary natural scientific partner of this sort of materialist project. Whereas for me, without, at least not yet at this point, with the first question of the interview going into details, I think that the way that Zizek embraces quantum physics puts him at risk of either ending up, despite himself, with a rather traditionally reductive sort of materialism in which the physics of the extremely small is considered the sort of ultimate court of adjudication for, talking about, the existence, function, et cetera, of other levels and layers of reality. It's either that kind of, you either lapse back into a reductivism privileging.
Okay, you know what? You're breaking up a little bit, Adrian.
Are we back?
Yeah, we seem to be back. You kind of froze up a little bit, or probably for you, I froze up. Right?
Okay,
this is probably what you saw.
Yes, you appeared to freeze up. Yeah.
Right.
And but to cut a long story short, the shelling ingredient that Zizek adds then leads in his more recent work to something which sometimes, given I think what shelling is actually up to, you end up with something closer to a kind of panpsychism, in which the universe itself is already a kind of proto-subjectivity that then gives birth to finite minds, such as ourselves. And for me, avoiding those risks by not privileging quantum physics in the way that Zizek does is worthwhile. And moreover, I think that even just for the epistemological reason of we're so far from being able to map all of the links that presumably might exist between the quantum level and, say, the mid-scale reality that we inhabit, that claims about sort of links between quantum phenomena and how our own minds and function and who and what we are as the subjects that we are is just so beyond our power right now that it can only be highly speculative. And we still have a lot of work to do just simply getting a firm materialist understanding of the relationship between brain and mind, how our biology and the sorts of organisms that we are is related to these capacities we have as subjects who seem to be able to function differently than anything else you'll find in the rest of nature. That for me, it's biology, and especially the biology of the human organism, that is the privileged scientific partner of this sort of materialist project that Zizek and I share in common. But he is stuck to his quantum physical path, and that has resulted in a big difference, I think, between the two of us. It has a number of implications and consequences, but I'd say that's over the past decade really become clear. And so in texts like Less Than Nothing that appeared in 2012, but then a number of his philosophical works after that, and I'd say most notably in 2020, Sex and the Failed Absolute, he really doubles down on the idea that, all right, it's a certain interpretation of quantum physics that's the zero level of his dialectical materialist ontology. And I felt compelled to speak to some of the problems I see with that. And this was not as clear in his work at the time when I published Zizek's ontology.
Okay, so that's it almost sounds like what the terrain that you're working within, it might be the philosophy of science rather than I don't know, a political philosophy or a straightforward epistemology, and that when I hear, and I have the big fat book Less Than Nothing, but I have not read it yet. So when I hear Zizek talk about quantum physics, it always strikes me that he's using quantum physics as a sort of analogy for a psychoanalytic point, something to do with human subjectivity, and not really making a scientific claim about how quantum, like you mentioned, we're so far away from being able to make a scientific claim about how quantum level actions influence our brains or our minds, right?
Yeah.
That it seems so far away to me that he always seems to be almost talking of quantum physics in the way that a poet would, making a metaphor or analogy. But you're by pointing to this difference, you're making a different claim. You're saying no. In fact, he is trying to ground his philosophy in the sciences, or maybe he's trying to demonstrate what his philosophical approach, his Lacanian Hegelian approach to questions of ontology might do to inform a scientific inquiry. Is that right?
I think that's fair. Yes. And it's, of course, there are issues of interpretation here, and you might say, degrees of potential charity in terms of how we interpret him. And I do think that there is a lot to how you were framing things in the first half of the question, apropos what I think is, the more charitable interpretation, which is that, in the end, it's really a matter of employing quantum physics as a kind of mirror in which we can see revealed in a specific set of ways some of the peculiarities of the sorts of subjects that we are viewed from a psychoanalytic perspective. And another thing which lends further credence to that sort of interpretive take on what Zizek is doing is that, I mentioned that 1996 book, The Indivisible Remainder, in which, Zizek introduces, that's really the first place where he develops his reading of quantum physics along the lines that he's pursued much further since. And that book, is also very engaged with Schelling. And when Zizek talks about, for instance, so Schelling in the mid-18 teens, between 1811 and 1815, wrote 3 unfinished attempts at this project Schelling entitled Der Weltalter, The Ages of the World. And it's a very strange theosophical document, and it really, channels a lot of the Protestant mystics that Schelling was very familiar with, and there's quite a bit of God talk and of this this sort of story of the genesis of creation, retold in this heterodox, partly religious, partly philosophical manner, and it seems, just to put it very crudely, it seems just insanely speculative, like this crazy. Almost like hallucinatory or delusional, philosophical apparatus, along the lines of like Schreber's memoirs that Schelling composed, before Schreber himself. And Zizek there, he says, well, the best way to understand this Schelling is really to take this, even though it's about, in a way, the birth of the cosmos. It's cosmogony. It's better to interpret this as a kind of, set of metaphors or sort of symbolic narrative that's really about ontogenesis, about the birth of the singular subject rather than God's creation of the world. And that would seem to signal that, maybe if he's saying that about Schelling in the same book in which he's talking about quantum physics, maybe his reading of quantum physics is to be similarly interpreted as he suggests reading this Schelling. But then, even if you grant that about that 1996 book, I think that, particularly in his more recent work, and I mentioned, in fact, the most recent of his major philosophical books, 2020's Sex and the Failed Absolute, there I think you will find him really committing more to stronger claims in the vein that I'm critical of, namely, at the level of the relationship between philosophy of science and metaphysics, wanting to make some strong claims about the status of quantum entities and events vis-a-vis higher orders in the scale of size, at least, in reality, and especially, of course, our mindedness and like-mindedness. And that's where I think he starts getting himself into, he puts himself on thinner ice, shakier ground, and then opens himself up to certain criticisms. But I should add, just one last thing, I should add that my criticisms of him, though, when I take him to task for what I see as the risks he runs through his way of using Schelling and quantum physics in combination with each other, where he either risks lapsing back into reductivism or into some kind of implausible panpsychism, I make those criticisms in an immanent rather than external way. In other words, I show if Zizek was committed to the best and I think strongest, most defensible portions of his thought, he would be critical of these moves himself. And so it's in a way appealing to what I consider to be his better metaphysical angels when I issue some of these objections, rather than just saying you're wholly and completely on the wrong track.
Right. I understand that. Okay. So this is interesting. Could you restate the evidence that you just pointed to in Sex and the Failed Absolute that indicates that he's making this stronger claim? Because I didn't quite catch it. And if I didn't quite catch it, maybe the audience didn't either. Could you say that again?
Yeah. Yes. So in Sex and the Failed Absolute in particular, and I was struck, I was asked to provide a back cover endorsement for it, which I did. And I remember, I got the manuscript from its publisher, Bloomsbury, and read through it. And I was really taken aback by just how full-throatedly he went in for, all right, quantum physics is now foundational for my philosophical project, and that what I am trying to do in this book, in that 2020 book, is to reinvent dialectical materialism for today. And the key to doing this is to recognize that the zero level of our reality is this quantum proto-reality, the shadowy realm of very strange structures and processes that do not at all fit with what we ordinarily take reality to be at our mid-scale, very crude sensory perceptual level of experience. And that, Zizek links this distinction between reality as we experience it versus this shadowy proto-reality of the quantum physical real. He aligns this with Schelling's distinction between what Schelling calls ground versus existence, so Grund versus existence. And for Schelling, ground is again Hegel uses the phrase realm of shadows, which Zizek also draws on. But it is this. It's basically for Zizek in this 2020 book, that the zero level of reality is this quantum realm prior to the collapse of the wave function, and then existence, which is what we take ourselves to inhabit, is including within itself, our familiar experiential reality. This is a secondary product of the collapsing of that shadowy proto-reality, the congealing of certain elements of it at the expense of others into this greater degree of determinacy that makes our world what we take it to be, even though it's not primary but secondary. And he says, this vision is basically the sort of ultimate stake of what I'm now doing philosophically, and there it doesn't seem to be qualified by any caveats or parentheticals that would allow for a more, a reading that would say, well, this is really still for him just about a kind of symbolic narrative or set of metaphors or analogies for what happens at the level of psychoanalysis and the kind of subjectivity it's concerned with. I mean, he does seem to want to make much bolder, you might say, cosmological, cosmogenic, and metaphysical claims on the basis of this dual, in a way, this hybrid Schellingian Lacanian interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Yeah, it strikes me as we're talking about this. I'm following you. I think it strikes me that it's important for the audience that's listening, and for you and I both, and for Zizek and everybody to grapple with the dialectical aspect of Hegelian thought when we ask questions of this nature, because what I'm noticing is this split now is developed between approaching Zizek from the perspective of him describing the subject, whether it's a psychoanalytic subject or our own consciousness and the way we perceive and understand the world, and the world in itself, the ontological realm. And if you start with the ontological realm, whether it's the pre-collapse, whatever, quantum blah 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 that you mentioned, or the biological structure of the body, or water, or atoms, whatever you start with, you're starting to sort of set up this deterministic universe, even if it's a probabilistic universe.
Yes,
where the subjectivity that's arising is caused. It's mechanical in some way, it seems like, and we don't want to do that politically, but maybe we don't have a choice. But once you make that move, the subject seems to be dropping away. You seem to lose the subject in that move. And the reverse is also true. If I say, okay, well, he's just describing the psychoanalytic subject, he's describing aspects of the mind, it's like, okay, yeah, but what does that have to do with the world as it really is? So we can describe how neurotic we are, but we can't describe the world as it actually that we want to relate to at this point. And so it seems like we're, I don't know, split between a Kantian perspective, which would be this Freudian perspective or psychoanalytic perspective on Zizek, or I don't know, a Spinoza one where we're now talking about God, nature, matter, shaping who we are. We're just fitting into that structure. So what about Hegel? What about the dialectic?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I also wanted to say is you mentioned again politics in addition to philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of science. And you had asked me about that in the previous question. Just so I don't forget, I wanted to start by saying, what I find, interesting for me is that in terms of politics, Zizek and I think, are very close, and I'm deeply sympathetic generally. I mean, I'm not going to say I agree with everything that he lays out in terms of, especially his better known, kind of public intellectual statements about current events, et cetera. But I think there's there's profound agreement that vastly outweighs and dwarfs any disagreement, in terms of perspectives on politics between the two of us. Our disagreements are, I think, much more philosophical or metaphysical. But of course, for both of us, we're not willing to say, well, we're just going to do metaphysics after we've already, made certain, intellectually speaking, political theoretic commitments that we're then going to, build metaphysics around. That no, I mean, I'm not willing to go so far as to politicize all of philosophy such that, the traditional autonomy of theoretical philosophy as metaphysics, epistemology, ontology is entirely swallowed up by political concerns. And I think Zizek feels similarly, but I won't speak for him. But now, though, I want to, this is the question you just asked, I think is really fascinating. And in a way, it's in a sense taking into account inflation now, we could say the $1 trillion question that I think is what both Zizek and I are in part looking for through our ways of going back to Hegel and, attempting to extract certain implications from Hegel's corpus, is this issue of how do you, on the one hand, avoid the anti-realism, anti-naturalism, anti-materialism of something like Kant's transcendental idealism as what Hegel would call a subjective idealism, where it's really, we are, confined within the cage of our own subjectivity, and that everything that we relate to is, a reflection or a result of that subject structure and its mediation. We are barred any kind of, epistemic or, even speculative access to what the world is like in and of itself, as Kant would say, what it is an sich. And we have to accept, the consequences of Kant's self-styled Copernican revolution and realize that, we are in a way trapped within the prison house of subjectivity. And that is our lot. On the other hand, you have, and especially as nowadays this is associated with developments that go back to the so-called speculative realism movement, and its critique of Kant, et cetera. There has been this in the past couple of decades, particularly within continental philosophy, this pronounced return to metaphysics and, the idea of re-entitling ourselves, to the sort of speculation about the objective world that it seemed Kant had forbidden us to be able to pursue anymore. And I think that for Zizek and I, this is where we come back to your question, is really the big one, the $1 trillion one, is, the issue of, how do you, in a sense, do justice to both sides? Like, how do you take into account Kant's undeniably powerful, penetrating, massive set of objections, especially in the critique of pure reason, the first critique, to any kind of traditional naively realist metaphysics? How do you do justice to Kantian critique, but without, surrendering to its, full-blown anti-realism, anti-naturalism, anti-materialism? And how do we re-entitle ourselves to, be able to, do ontology in the more ambitious sense of really taking into account the world as it is an sich in itself, without then inviting all of the, and inviting unanswered all of the powerful Kantian objections, against pre-Kantian metaphysics. And that's the big project, I think, in a way for both of us is being able to bring together the critical sensibilities of something like Kant's transcendental perspective with, at the same time, because the notion that, there are all sorts of problems for Kant that basically generate much of what happens in post-Kantian idealism after him. There are real problems with how he attempts to enforce that strict distinction between this side of the limits of possible experience and what are knowable phenomenal objects for us, versus the other side of it where we're dealing with unknowable noumenal things in themselves, the notorious Ding an sich of Kant's philosophy. There are serious problems with all of that, but at the same time, it's not as though you can just ignore all of Kant's objections to the naive realism of a more traditional pre-Kantian metaphysics. So we're both, and Schelling is relevant here too. He already, in his 1800 system of transcendental idealism, tried to set up a model where you needed to have both the subject centrism of Kantian transcendental idealism, and then the objective, world-oriented perspective of a more realist kind of metaphysics or ontology, which for Schelling he associated with his Naturphilosophie, his philosophy of nature, and that these two things were mutually complementary. Transcendentalism explains to us how we know what we know about ourselves and the world, and philosophy of nature explains how this very knowing itself and the subject that is its agent came to be out of a pre-subjective objectivity that is, for Schelling, nature. And, likewise, Hegel is engaged in similar kinds of balancing acts between traditional metaphysics and Kantian critique along these lines. And it's a kind of unfinished endeavor that I think Zizek and I both see ourselves as picking up and attempting to run with a couple of centuries later, hence the title of that book of mine you mentioned at the start, A New German Idealism.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So a couple of thoughts come to mind about Hegel. The argument that I always turn to when I try to summarize Hegel to some poor soul who might have been tricked into asking me to, right? As I say that, when we encounter, Hegel says, I said, well, there's this idea from Kant that we are cut off from the world, that we have the limits of our own understanding imposed upon us, that we don't have access to anything outside of what we can perceive, and therefore, all we can understand is the categories of our own perception, which he tries to outline. And then there's Hegel's response to that, which is to say, when you claim that you found a limit to thought, you've already defined what's beyond it. You've already understood this realm of the beyond, and understood it, or have had a. I'm going to want to get to this difference between understanding and reason eventually, but I won't right now. You've already perceived it. In any case, you've found the beyond. By placing a limit in a certain location, you are defining the other. You're defining what you cannot see. So you've already overcome the very limit you think is insurmountable. And that is a very nice little elegant argument. What it ultimately means is sometimes tricky. People don't always walk away going, oh, now I'm a Hegelian when I say this to them. But I think what it means when it comes to the difference between, say, a psychoanalytic subjectivity and the ontological facts about the world would be that wherever we point to find our ontology, wherever whether we are strictly Kantian and say, we simply have, like, a good example would be Chomsky to me as a modern Kantian, although he wouldn't agree. But he says, look, there is just no physical anymore. We have no concept of the physical. There is no material world. We are so far away from ever having any grasp on reality, such as it is, being such limited creatures, that we might as well stop talking about the physical. We should talk instead about very intricate systems of perception. Starting with the intricacies of lesser life forms like insects. Maybe we could master that before we try to understand what the physical is, right? Of course, there's something a little odd about that because there's such an empirical project.
Yeah.
Right. But so that would be Chomsky's perspective. And when you question him about, what the basis of his knowledge is, what is it to be a scientific theory? What grounds his theory, if not some reference to the real?
Yeah.
He kind of spins around in circles, and I think, and so it's clear to me that that he's already always referencing something like the real or the physical or the material world, even as he denies it. And so the fact that our subjectivity relies upon positing the real, it is, I think, in a Hegelian move, the most real thing we can know. That is the substance of the world. Is this activity of positing rather than some fixed being that we can have reference to. So I don't know. That was, you got to hear me think aloud, so you enjoyed that.
Yeah.
I'll let you respond.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and I think a couple of things. One would be to just start with the more focused issue of Hegel's critique of Kant's theoretical philosophy specifically, and so in particular, Hegel's way of addressing Kant's notion of a strict epistemological outer limit, namely that of possible experience. On one side, you have what is knowable, namely phenomenal objects as appearances that are themselves the result of our subjective structure and activity, generating this field of phenomena that we can then, parse according to our categories and concepts and generate what legitimately can count as knowledge for us, versus, again, on the other side of the limits of possible experience, the unknowable realm of noumenal things in themselves, the world as it is apart from us, about which we can purportedly know nothing. And you mentioned, of course, Hegel's one of his many objections to this Kant, his famous discussion of the very figure of the limit, this notion of limit that Kant, relies upon in his idea of critique as policing that boundary line between the knowable and the unknowable. And of course, I think, very accurately summarized how Hegel problematizes that. A historical footnote to that is that is an objection Hegel inherited from his predecessors, and in particular from F.H. Jacobi, who, in polemicizing against Kant's first critique in the mid-1780s, famously said about the thing in itself in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Jacobi quipped, that without Kant's thing in itself, I can't enter into a system, but with Kant's thing in itself, I can't remain within that same system. And pointing out that Kant, in a way, Kant claims we can't know anything about the other side of the limits of possible experience. Yet he knows, supposedly, that it consists of things, that these things exist in themselves as apart from for us. That they somehow, perhaps Kant even, is occasionally compelled to say they, somehow things in themselves act upon us so as to generate in us this experience of a phenomenal object. But then that seems to involve Kant violating his rule about, well, you can't apply a category of the understanding like causality beyond the limits of possible experience. But to talk about a thing causing our experience of an object is to apply that category of causality to something noumenal, which violates Kant's epistemological strictures, and things rapidly become an inconsistent mess. And Jacobi pointed this out, and then Schelling, Fichte, and Hegel, the big three of post-Kantian idealism, all followed him in attacking this as one of the weak points in Kant's philosophy, and his theoretical philosophy especially. And all of the German idealists after Kant attempted to rework what they inherited from Kant without reliance upon the problematic thing in itself that had become a lightning rod for so much criticism, starting with Jacobi. Now, with Hegel, though, I think, and this also allows me to speak to a few things I didn't really answer yet in previous questions you've already asked too. If we look at Hegel's system, we have to recognize Hegel's system consists of three core components that are represented by the three volumes of his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. What Hegel calls logic, then philosophy of nature, and then after that, philosophy of mind or spirit, Geist. Hegel's logic, one way to read it in terms of his relationship to Kant, is that the entirety of what Hegel calls logic is concerned with the sort of thinking that Kant is focused on in his theoretical philosophy, and looking at how the thinking subject internally generates out of itself this whole network of categories and concepts that enable things to be intelligible for it. And that, of course, is a kind of Kantian endeavor that Hegel takes over from his illustrious predecessor. But then that the logic, as Hegel develops that how the thinking subject unfolds from out of itself this network of categories and concepts, Hegel shows how some of the very categories and concepts that Kant relies upon for talking about this thinking subject themselves internally problematize and undo the sort of picture Kant wants. And so Hegel tries to imminently critique, to undo from within Kant's subjectivism, his anti-realism, his anti-materialism, his anti-naturalism, to undo that within the very realm that Kant restricts theoretical philosophy to. And after he accomplishes that at the end of the logic, he has then re-entitled himself to then look at the roles of nature and history as external to the subject, as preceding the subject, as shaping it from outside in a way that isn't acknowledged by the extreme subjectivism of transcendental idealism a la Kant and frankly a la Fichte too. And Hegel, instead of bypassing Kant, he passes through Kant so as to undo Kant, in a sense, to show how Kant, in a way, hoists himself by his own petard. This is good Hegelian dialectics. Show how Kant's position undoes itself on its own terms. And Hegel does that in the logic, and even with the logic as a whole. And then he demonstrates how we are, in a sense, forced, once we work through the problems internal to transcendental idealism by its own lights, we are forced to re-embrace what Kant said we had to abandon, namely more ontologically ambitious perspectives that bring into consideration that which we could say transcends the subject, precedes it, is outside it, is beyond it, but that it still has access to. And Hegel thinks his critiques of Kant's thing in itself show that there isn't this realm of, as Hegel puts it in his 1802 Glauben und Wissen text, faith and knowledge. It's not that there's this realm of these formless lumps out there that we then just impose, the structures of space, time, categories, and concepts onto. It's that they are already spatially, temporally, and in a way kind of proto-intelligibly structured out there. And that's why the real is inherently knowable for us. It's not that we ever know all of it. Like, when you describe Chomsky, it sounded like the false dilemma between either we know everything about what we call physical nature, or we just have to claim we're hopelessly cut off from being able to ever say anything about it. For Hegel, the fact that the extra subjective real is not a set of just formless lumps as Kantian things in themselves, but is all already structured before we come on the scene, and in ways that, since we're a product of it too, we are structured similarly. That the isomorphisms between subjective and objective structures render the objective real inherently knowable, hence not in itself in the Kantian sense of forever withdrawn. But that doesn't mean that for Hegel we ever reach a point at which we can say we know everything under the sun, in terms of we have, exhaustively penetrated all of those structures apart from us. It's just that there's nothing that's inherently refractory out there to the further advance and encroachment of our concepts and our knowing.
Well, I want to go back. I want to talk to you about some of the things that you talked about in your book. Because at the beginning of your book, you describe the difference between, or at least you point to the difference between reason and understanding. I think actually you describe it in such depth that I had to loop back and see if I could figure out the difference. So I'm going to ask you about it now. But what is the difference from Hegel's point of view between, I'm not going to say the German, just to go understanding and reason,
Yes.
and to clarify where I'm at right now, it seems like reason is on the side of the sensuous, the empirical. Maybe it would be the kind of apparatus or understanding that I don't want to use the word understanding, but it would be the kind of knowledge we can glean about the world that has some relationship to the world that is outside of our own perception. Well, in some way, whereas understanding is reductionist, abstract, and maybe esoteric or yeah. So is that a clear distinction between understanding and reason?
That is how it's sometimes taken due to certain remarks that Hegel makes, and especially when, he quotes a certain Goethe and he talks about the understanding as, as black and white or also as this kind of, washed out gray of abstraction versus, the thriving, almost overwhelmingly rich greenness of the tree of life itself is how things really are, and that reason is better able to get at that. But at the start of a new German idealism, at the beginning of that book, part of what I seek to do, and in a way that I think is necessary to also understand how Zizek uses the Hegelian distinction between understanding, Verstand, and reason, Vernunft, is to say that, well, actually for Hegel, one thing that he insists upon, and there's, this is simply a matter of historical fact. I mean, if you go back and you look at the primary source material, you will find Hegel saying this in a number of places. Hegel claims that well, let me back up for a minute. I should first just define the two terms for our listeners and then say what Hegel does with them. I think that would be better for the sake of clarity. So yes, when Hegel talks about the understanding, much of what you said indeed, is an accurate echo of his characterization. So for Hegel, the understanding initially would seem to be the most, commonsensical and self-evident way to look at the world, where we have, where basically what we're doing is we're approaching things with a cognitive style that is very close to the sensibilities enshrined in classical bivalent logic. So you have the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. A equals A does not equal not A, and something is either true or false, and that's that, right? And it's quite cut and dry. And that linked to this, use of a perspective that very much is resonant with classical bivalent logic. The understanding likes neat and clean black and white lines of demarcation. It likes to sort all of the things it comes across, into the appropriate, taxonomic or categorical boxes, and it splices up reality. It carves it up into this aggregate of, separate, partitioned, individuated points of reference, and attempts to get to grips with it in that way. And when Hegel talks about dialectics, one of the things he means by this is what he calls, in the logic, the negative side of it. And what dialectics as the negative side of reason does is it shows how what the understanding takes to be simple, straightforward, self-evident, especially the distinctions that the understanding draws, with which it thinks, it has, a reliable tool and a stable, sort of configuration that enables it to pin things down and keep them in their proper places. Hegelian dialectics, like the dialectics of the ancients, that you'll find in texts like, Plato's Parmenides, or, some of the thought exercises of the ancient skeptics, etc. And the paradoxes that you get, things like Zeno's paradox. Hegel draws on that tradition in the history of philosophy to show that what the understanding takes to be cut and dried, fixed and firm, black and white, dichotomies, dualisms, oppositions, contrasts, etc., are quite unstable, and where the distinction can end up being turned on its head, or one term can lose its distinctiveness from the other, etc. And you go through this process of finding that all of a sudden what previously from the understanding's perspective alone seemed to be fixed and firm, cut and dried, black and white, is now a hopelessly muddied set of blurred shades of gray, etc. And then for Hegel, we pass through that sort of destabilization, that rendering volatile and unreliable the framework of the understanding erected in the way that it does. To then be able to generate, it's not like it just leaves us in a swooning confusion. For Hegel, we can then extract certain positive results from that process of internally destabilizing the understanding through the process of negative reason as dialectic. Mm-hmm. And we can then come to the positive side of reason, which for Hegel is speculation, where there are certain definite results of this dynamic of dialecticizing the understanding. And for Hegel, though, the key thing, though, is that there is no shortcut. There is no way we can just bypass the understanding and working through its self-generated problems in the guise of dialectics. What Hegel talked about as tearing with the negative, or that patience of the concept, involves having to work through the understanding and its self-induced dialectical instability in order to arrive at true speculative insight as the positive contribution of reason. But for Hegel, with figures like Fichte and especially the young Schelling, he claimed appealed to this power to just immediately penetrate the veil of illusion, to see through the curtain of appearances and immediately grasp reality as it is in and of itself. And Hegel mocked that. It was just like what he saw as epistemologically lazy and indefensible. No, you just have this magic power, like a shot from a pistol, to immediately commune with reality. And no, for Hegel, however problematic the understanding is, without the understanding, we would just be left empty-handed. We would have no basis for making claims. So even though we have to, in a sense, internally work through and move beyond the understanding, it's not a disposable ladder. Without it, we could not get anywhere at the level of reason. And so that's, in a nutshell, how I understand. So it's like we have to do the abstracting violence of the understanding to reality in order to get to something more than that. There's no possibility to have the speculative more without passing through, you might say, the abstracting reductive less of the understanding.
Yeah, we have to make the mistake of cutting reality along maybe indefensible lines, separating things out, setting up oppositions before we can overcome those oppositions and set up something new.
But to put it crudely, you could say for Hegel, we can only learn through our mistakes. Like the phenomenology, for instance, is just a series of misadventures of distorting, lopsided, skewed perspectives that Hegel calls figures or shapes of consciousness / spirit. And only after we run this lengthy historical gamut of all of these missteps do we have a hope of getting anywhere at the end with the transition to Hegel's system. So it's definitely, we have to fall on our face, and it's like Beckett's try again, fail better. That really is, in a certain way, a very profoundly Hegelian sentiment.
We've been talking for about 47 minutes. What I want to do is keep you on a little longer and create something for the patrons, because I have people who pay a little bit more to get a second half. There's still so much more to cover, actually. There's so many more questions I have for you. Do you have another 45 minutes, 30 to 45
Absolutely.
minutes? What do you think?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
So why don't I do this? I'm going to end this stream, and I'm going to let me get your email address. I'm going to end this stream, and I'll email you a new link. So I'm going to stop it here. Okay.